Hi everybody and welcome to another episode of Historia Politica Publica. This is the third episode of the series about Noam Chomsky and his book on Anarchism. In the first episode I spoke about Noam Chomsky, his career as a political theorist, philosopher, linguistic historian and activist. In the second one I start to talk about on anarchism, his book about this ideology, and focusing on the first chapter of the book. It is divided in 5 chapters. I finished halfway, and now in the third chapter, in the third episode, of this series, I want to finish with the chapter of Notes on Anarchism, which, as I mentioned in the last episode, it is a guide of anarchism through different references from people like Daniel Guerin, Rudolf Rocker, Bakunin. Also, there are quotes from Marx, from Engels, which were more aligned to Marxist communists. And at that time, they had fights, but nowadays, Chomsky believed that Marxism and anarchism are mostly the same thing. So, going to the idea that Chomsky exposes constantly in his writings, that anarchism is the inheritor of the Enlightenment, and point to people especially like John Stuart Mill and Humboldt. He mentioned how for Humboldt, which was a political theorist from of the 18th century, he wrote extensively. There is one important document in 1792 about the need for egalitarianism. It was created in the context of the French Revolution, and he pointed how the idea of development must be done through the combination of technology plus the freedom of the people. However, this proper development and the use of the means, the progress of technology, must be carried not under the condition of autocratic control of production by those who make humans an instrument to serve their ends, but rather by a common consensus among the people. And this is told by Humboldt, which is considered as a kind of liberal nowadays, but Chomsky very wittingly point how his ideas were very similar to the anarchist philosophy nowadays. Also, for Chomsky, one of the important things about the anarchist movement, it is what it was defined. I think it was by Rocker. It was it was another anarchist which is called Buber, which wrote Path of Utopia. The idea to create the third and last emancipatory phase of history. The first having made serfs out of slaves, feudalism. The second having made wage earners out of serfs, feudalism to capitalism, and the third which abolishes the proletariat in a final act of liberation that places control over the economy in the hands of free and voluntary associations of producers. And I'm sorry because this quote, it was said by Fourier, which was a French intellectual in 1848, which was a socialist and relate to this kind of 3 phases on the history of development, from slavery to feudalism, from feudalism to capitalism, and eventually will be from capitalism to socialism. Because it is interesting how in that year 1848, Tocqueville, Alexis de Tocqueville, which was a French person who traveled to America and wrote in 1835 and 1842 books which were called Democracy in America, which are very interesting to read because in 1835 he travels across the continent and he points the benefits of democracy in the new created country. Well, new created, it had only 60 years of existence, and he points, here everything is good, people have freedom to decide and so on. But in 1840, after he does another round in the continent, in the United States, he changed completely his perspective, like, okay, I was wrong, I see that here, even though there is not an implicit coercion, an explicit coercion, there is a subtlety in which people are forced to think similarly, because if you think otherwise as the rest of the mass, you will be disdained, you will be isolated. So you have the freedom, of course, to think differently, but that will mean that you won't have job, that you won't have even friends, and so on. And it is great because reading the two books in continuation make you realize that how important it is to see the different things that are happening in society through different angles. And Tocqueville is great at that, because whereas in 1835, in the first volume of Democracy in America, he praised the American society, in 1840, just 5 years later, he criticized everything about that and the lie that, according to him, is democracy at that moment in America. And we can extrapolate to now our societies nowadays, like, okay, you can say whatever you want, you are free to think differently from your family, from your friends, and everything is okay. We are not going to put you in jail, okay, unless you are Julian Assange and you expose secrets about American state and killing and murdering in Iraq and Afghanistan and their involvement in the affairs of the world. But let's say that even though you are not in prison, you will be isolated from the people, which it is makes difficult to kind of stay have an independent state of mind. And this is also represented in Years and Years by Edith, which is the one of the daughters who is like the person who is traveling around the world, being an activist, protesting, vegan, anarchist, denouncing the injustice of the world, and how she's considered as the weird of the family. These kind of mechanisms that are inherent in society to denounce in an implicit way those subversive elements that are among us. So, in the book of Notes on Anarchism of Chomsky, there is also some testimonies about the Commune of Paris, the Paris Commune of 1871. It was created in March 1871. It was crushed by violence in 1871, 2 months later. The numbers of deaths are between 20,000 and 30,000, plus 60,000 people exiled. And it is interesting, this is related with something that Chomsky does in his book, in the chapter 3, about liberal scholarship and objectivity, how the French Revolution, it was considered something carried on blood, without of murders, and so on. And at the end, there was in total 17,000 people killed by the guillotine, which many of them were not even by Robespierre, because Robespierre was even killed by guillotine, but during the whole decade. But this is point how the reign of terror was something evil, murdering, and so on. Whereas the Paris Commune, nobody knows about that, and there were much more people killed, and also in less time, because there is a week which is called the Bloody Week, in which the force of the French state basically went there and started to kill everybody. Many people were in prison in New Caledonia, the island in Oceania, and even I have read some testimonies that people with long white beards and white hair, they were put in prison, even though there was no proof that they had participated in the commune. But they think, okay, these people are very old, so surely they have participated in the revolution of 1848, so they are a traitor to the country. So about the Paris Commune, Bakunin wrote that it was their objective to abolish property and intended to abolish the class property, which makes the labor of the many the wealth of the few. It aimed at the expropriation of the expropriator. End quote. Also, Marx, who wrote a book called The Civil War in France, defines to as going what happened in the Commune and the repression. Quote, "The civilization and justice of bourgeois order come out in its lurid light whenever the slaves and drudge of that order rise against their masters. Then this civilization and justice stand for us and this with savagery and lawless revenge. The infernal deeds of the soldiery reflect the innate spirit of that civilization of which they are the mercenary vindicators. The bourgeoisie of the whole world, which looks complacently upon the wholesale massacre after the battle, is convulsed by horror at the desecration of brick and mortar, end quote. Interestingly, Marx points how the people are more horrified when they see like buildings being destroyed, something in the street, like let's say the containers burning and so on, rather than when people are killed. Both believe that the Paris Commune was a pioneer aspect of the modern history, the first working class movement, and how it set an example for future generations. And in fact, Lenin, it is said that he was widely inspired by the Paris Commune, and there is an anecdote that I think Slavoj Žižek told in one of his interviews, that there was a day in January, I think, or February, in Russia, in which Lenin, it was snowing outside, and Lenin went out and started to play in the snow, like apparently laughing and throwing snowballs. And one person go there and say, "Come on, what are you doing here? It's freezing. Why are you so happy? It's very cold." And he apparently replied, "Because now, after the Russian Revolution, we have lasted one day more than the Paris Commune." So this shows how ideologically was influenced by the Paris Commune, but also Lenin studied widely the book of Marx, of the Civil War in France, the writing by Engels, and so on, to draw some lessons for the future state, the Soviet Union. Noam Chomsky, in his chapter, he defines an anarchist like that, quote, "The consistent anarchist should be a socialist, but a socialist of a particular sort," end quote. So, as I mentioned earlier, for him, it is being a socialist, an anarchist, mean a libertarian socialist, believing in the freedom of the people to progress through society, to engage in the community, and so on. And in that sense, Chomsky makes a lot of reference to the Spanish Revolution that it happened in Catalonia in 1936-1937. The social revolution must in that way replace it by the industrial organization of society with direct war control. And apart from the Spanish example, he points how in Germany and Italy after World War I, there were some examples of this idea. In Germany, you have the Soviets in Munich, for instance, or in Italy, the Red 2 years from 1918-1920 until it was crushed by the fascists in Italy and by the Free Corps in Germany. Free Corps, a far-right paramilitary group, which was later on, many of them became members of the Nazi Party, but they were mostly supported by the Social Democrats to crush the communist movement. In that sense, for Chomsky and the anarchists, the humans will not be free to develop his or her own potentialities to their fullest, and the producer will remain a fragment of a human being, degraded, a tool in the productive process direct from above, unless there is a complete freedom and liberty and equality in the whole society. There is not a coincidence that these themes, that égalité, fraternité, liberté, are mentioned by Noam Chomsky and other anarchists, those ideas of the French Revolution, of the Enlightenment, because as I mentioned in the other episode, Chomsky and Humboldt and many other thinkers makes a relation between these ideas of the Enlightenment and the anarchist movement. In fact, going back to the case of Spain, Chomsky rejects the idea that what happened in Catalonia was a spontaneous revolutionary action, because according to him, this can be misleading. Because the anarcho-syndicalists at least took very seriously Bakunin's remark that the workers' organization must create not only the ideas but also the fact of the future itself in the pre-revolutionary period. According to Chomsky, the accomplishment of the popular revolution in Spain, in particular, were based on the patient work of many years of organization and education, one component of a long tradition of commitment and militancy, which was involved in the CNT. There was a time in Barcelona that more than 1 million people were, 400,000 people were members of the CNT. That meant at that time that 1 of each 3 person in Barcelona were members of the CNT, which is crazy if you think that, like, so more than the 30% of the people in Barcelona were members of the CNT. You have people like Bonaventura Durruti, who was killed in 1936, which was one of these figures of anarchism known over the world. And the CNT movement in Andalusia, in Catalonia, was very powerful in Spain, and alongside the anarchism in Russia, in Ukraine, in Italy and Latin America, the Spanish was one of the most important, if not the most important of all of those. According to Daniel Guerin, the historian who wrote in 1970 the book Anarchism from Theory to Practice, quote, "The Spanish Revolution was relatively mature in the minds of the libertarian thinkers as in the popular consciousness," end quote. This is important because it is, as Chomsky said, was not a spontaneous uprising, but during decades the CNT organization, the Anarchos Syndicate, was engaging with different people. They were learning from each other. They were carrying different actions to create this idea of mutual aid, common solidarity. And when the moment came after the coup d'etat of Franco, they revolted against the army. And they took the telephone exchange, the different industries of the city, and there have been economic reports about how Barcelona at that time was doing very well in spite of being under the war. But eventually the anarchism was crushed, not just for Francoism, but even before by Stalinist communists. In that regard, the anarchist Agustin Xoxi writes about the collectivization in Spain, quote, "For many years, the anarchists and syndicalists of Spain considered their supreme task to be the social transformation of the society. In their assemblies of syndicates and groups, in their journals, their brochures and books, the problem of the social revolution was discussed incessantly and in a systematic phase," end quote. Henceforth, the importance of reading, of engaging, being aware of what is happening in their surroundings, the books, the journals, all of this is fundamental to create the anarchist movement, because anarchism gives a lot of importance for the individual. The individual must learn, must know about theory, but also about practice. So using this theory to put in practice these ideas. And in fact, Daniel Guerin in his book mentioned how 19th century anarchism was more doctrinal, because it was more about learning different ways to change society. And you have the greetings of Proudhon, of Bakunin, of Peter Kropotkin, which I have not talked too much about him, but he has 2 books which are very important to understand anarchism, The Conquest of the Bread and Mutual Aid. And in the 20th century, these ideas were put on practice in different regions, as I mentioned, in Ukraine, in Spain, in Italy, in some parts, Latin America, even in Korea, and so. And perhaps, as many anarchists agree, the Spanish case in Catalonia was the most illustrative about how an anarchist movement can work for the society. So, I think I will finish the episode here. And what I wanted to say, the last thing I wanted to say it is a quote about Bakunin, in which he wrote a manifesto in 1865, and he predicted that one element in the social revolution will be, quote, "that intelligent and truly noble part of the youth which, though belonging by birth to the privileged classes, in its generous conviction and ardent aspiration, adopts the cause of the people," end quote. In that sense, Bakunin hoped that anarchism will not be just an inclusionary group of working class people, but rather making those people from the upper classes to participate in the movement. And this reminds me, obviously, to the May 68 in France, in which the students aligned themselves with the workers. during the May events, how there was a general strike in which 10 million people participated during those protests, 10 million people in France in 1968, and the students had a great role during that movement, and not just in France but also in Germany, in Italy, even in Spain, although here it was crushed by Francoism. But it's important how Bakunin in 1865 appealed to the people who maybe had a privileged life, but inherently they wanted to create a better world. We have the famous example like Che Guevara living in a kind of middle upper class in Cordoba, Argentina, being a doctor, or Fidel Castro being a lawyer, people who had a great role in the Cuban Revolution. Also Salvador Allende, a person who was a doctor, was from middle upper class bourgeoisie, but he wanted to become president of Chile to create socialism, and he defines himself as a Marxist. And like that, there are many examples in history of how the people from the upper upbringing could join the anarchist movement, because anarchism means liberty, and eventually this will help society to progress towards a better world. So, just to finish, I would like to recommend some books that I will write in the description of the episodes that I think are the most important about anarchism. I believe that the one that I have been talking in the last episode on Anarchism of Chomsky, it's a great way to enter in the ideology of anarchism, to know more historically and philosophically what anarchism means. But also you have books like of Emma Goldman, some texts like The Individual Society and the State, Love and Marriage, which speak about the role of women and their possibility of emancipation. You have Anarchism and Other Essays by Emma Goldman, covers different topics in society, feminism, also the philosophy and the political theory and so on. Bakunin, God and State, the idea of religion and science, and how anarchist movement must be able to proceed from a different way. Kropotkin, I mentioned earlier, The Conquest of the Bread, the Mutual Aid, which speak, the thesis is this written during the time when people like Herbert Spencer have tergiversed the meaning of social Darwinism, and for Kropotkin, the progress in humanity has always been done through cooperation rather than individual competition in a kind of selfish way. And he gives some examples in the medieval period, the modern period, these pre-capitalist, pre-feudal societies, and even give an example of how the animals, when they act together, such as the bear, how they go together, of the fish, it can help them to progress as a species. David Graeber is great. He died in 2020. He published a book with David Gengro about The Dawn of Everything, which tells the history of humanity. But apart from that, he wrote anarchist texts, like one is called Are You an Anarchist? The Answer Might Surprise You, and give some kind of guidelines to see if you are really an anarchist, even though you don't know that. Also the 5,000 Years Debt, also On Bullshit Job, and so on. So these names: David Graeber, Daniel Guérin, Anarchism from Theory to Practice, Emma Goldman, Bakunin, Kropotkin, Buenaventura Durruti, Noam Chomsky, obviously. I mean, there are many great anarchists, and because anarchism focuses on this idea of the need to enlighten every individual and to learn, it is, I think, very interesting for everybody to put the full potential of humanity, because anarchism believes in the humans as a kind of torch to progress to a better world, and believes that every individual can make the difference. And here I finish the series about Anarchism by Noam Chomsky. I will talk about other books related with this philosophy in the next episode in other series. Thanks for listening. Hope you have liked it. Please send some recommendation about anarchist writings. If you believe that I've forgotten to talk about something, let me know. And it will be great to engage in conversation with all of you. Thanks so much for listening to this series.